I would like to share some thoughts about seeing as an ability with you today. And I have a background as an artist and as a teacher, and actually as a designer as well. And I have been interested deeply in the matter of seeing as an ability. So, first of all of us once have been blind, and actually, all of us once have been blind, and we have developed some abilities according to our eyes and according to our neurotic abilities and our neurocognitive abilities, which has allowed us to use our eyes to have orientation in our surroundings and to interpret people and everything which is surrounding us. But we are so used to this very basic skill of ours, which is seeing. So we don't very often think that we see. We don't think that we hear. At least we don't have any problems according to those abilities or our senses. But it's very important to once at a time think why actually we do this and to ask the question why. So first place where we can ask ourselves those questions is coming back to our scholar period, to our education. And let's think for a moment about the school and what actually school has provided for all of us. School is viewed as a place and as a moment in the life of a human being that we accumulate knowledge. Except for that, in our modern society, we accumulate not only knowledge, but also abilities. It's a little bit old view of the education where we only learn things, learn them by heart, and we are adults who can repeat those things to the next, in our following life. But also we have to remember that our abilities, which we are developing through the learning process, are sometimes even more important than the knowledge itself. In the times of the internet, of the very common access to libraries, to every possible type of literature, we might think what actually learning language or what actually learning maths is actually giving us the benefit. So how do we learn? Learning process is accumulation of repeated action. Repeated action is leaving the pattern in our brains, and the pattern which can be weaker or stronger, and it depends on how many times we repeat the action, how many times we repeat the information, how old is the link between informations, and many other factors which actually can strengthen or weaken our information in our brain. The same goes with habits. The same goes with actually every single part of us which we are made of. So if you think about school, the most acknowledgeable parts of school are those connected with language and those connected with maths, science, biology, geography. And throughout those lists of different parts of education we actually learn during the school process, there's one part which is left a little bit behind. This is the arts education. And I used to be a teacher, actually not so long ago, in an art school. And for me, the process of learning arts is probably something a little bit different than for the most of our society. Actually, I'm thinking not only about the Polish society, I think it's something about the global society. And we view art as a therapy, a relax, a moment of relief, the stress relief. It can boost the self-esteem, confidence, or even sometimes it's told something as something which can actually build pride in a person who is performing arts. Especially this fragment is actually from the paper about art education itself. And as you can see, those things which I have mentioned are stressed there. And well, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a really common perspective on the matter. For me, art education is something different. It's solving the problems, the visual problems. It's colliding with different types of information. For me, the learning arts is about training. It's about the design thinking process. It's about solving problems which are not only visual but sometimes on the connected with the use of the objects, with the perception of the movement of an object. It's actually lots and lots and lots of analysis, then performed into the physical matter. And it may differ from the fine arts, where we actually work with the image, to the design, when we have to deal with an object and its function. Here I have a quote of the paper of Dr. Aldona Skudrzyk and PhD Jacek, I believe, Warchoł. And this is the part which is actually about the text. So the text forces linear, coherent discourse, the reading of which stimulates conscious process, thanks to which we are able to build fictional sense to our experiences. And this is something which is a bit opposite. It stays in the as the opposite to the visual information, because it actually praises the text. When we have an artist, especially the modern type of artist, we tend to see some piece of art which is maybe not accessible for many people unless we read the description. Much of the arts is very strongly based on the language which is describing the visual part. We think as an art, I cannot speak, of course, about all of the artists. Maybe it is my point of view that this language part is a little bit to prove the worthiness of the visual matter which is standing next to the description. For me, when I was graduating the Academy of Fine Arts, it was very. I hadn't actually been sure why. Why is it like this? For me, working with an image is something different from working with a language. And actually I would like to move a little bit to the neurocognitive processes which are connected to the perceiving of an image and perceiving of a text. Text is a part of a language. Language is a part of naming our surroundings and naming everything which we have ever thought about during our lives. But to have the language, we have to first have the image. And this image we have to name. It's about the question how those words got there in the first place. There's a part of neurotic sciences which is called neuroplasticity, and it's actually a subject from those studies. And neuroplasticity is also known as neural plasticity or brain plasticity, and this is the ability of the brain to change through growth and reorganization. And the difference between language and visual information is very deeply biological. When we perceive the visual information, our main receptor are the eyes. The root of the eyes, of the information, which is provided by our retinal system, is going through the eyes to the occipital lobe. And then we have different streams for the visual information. We have the what pathway and so-called where pathway and how pathway. First is about recognition and form representation. This is the storage for long-term memory. The second one, it's like the downstream. It's about the motion representation of objects, location, spatial awareness, and guidance in actions. Here we can see that first is the perception. We have to perceive, we have to notice the thing which our eyes are connected with somehow by the wave, by the wave. So when we receive the information, our brain has to interpret this information and has to provide us with the understanding of what actually we see. I'll just take a quick look what next. Okay. What is for us, I think, is the very, very common perception of this process, that this is passive process. Well, actually, it's not in 100% the passive process. Actually, it's very active process. As you can see, with those two streams, we have the recognition and we have the discussion with the form. We have to access the long-term memory, and we have to decide which parts of the information we are going to remember, which parts of the information is familiar to us, and which part of this information actually has some echo in our personality. Second one is connected with motion, and the object location is about not only what is it, but where is it, what's the connection, and what's the context for every single thing we see. We have to actually stress in this part that what we can see is not only the object itself, but actually it can be the part of an object. It can be like we have different parts of an image which we are seeing. If we perceive a thing as an object, we perceive the common features of this thing as a togetherness. It's actually very important to understanding of how actually image is built up in our mind and in our memory. To name something, the shape and the object. To name something an object, first we perceive the shape. So we have an object or a background. We have to differentiate an object from the background, and actually to have this perception that this thing is separate, we have to merge the shape, connect it together, and we have to understand features which are common for the thing. First comes the shape, not the color, not the light, not the depth, not the other features of the thing, but actually the shape. There has been very interesting work of PhD Pawan Sinha, who actually has challenged the concept of critical period. Because what is actually the critical period? We believe that the person to have this ability to differentiate object from the background and to later on to have to understand other features of an object, which means the color, the depth, etc., the texture, and so on, has to develop in brain those connections which are connecting the eye with the perceptive part, those occipital lobe. There has been a work of two scientists, David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel, and they won in 1981 the Nobel Prize for the critical period theory. They have performed an experiment on kittens, and they have closed their eyes on in different ways, and they actually developed the theory that we can't learn how to see if we haven't learned it at the beginning of our lives, and there is actually some critical period after which we are not able to develop the ability to see. So basically, we treat eyes as this connector to this part of the brain, and if we haven't this connection, it's just not going to work anymore in our lives. Because of this theory of critical period, which is, it's 1981, the Nobel Prize, we have very, very deeply influenced our art education, our perception of seeing, and our treatment to children who have some issues with their eyes. It's actually some closing of the discussion. This is also connected with the treatment of not only children, but later on the people who has different problems with the vision. And it's very top subject of research nowadays, and it's very deeply connected to neuroplasticity. So we are actually asking the questions: is it possible to learn anything more than you have learned when you have been a child? Is it possible to expand your vision above the thing that you are just noticing things? This research about critical period has been challenged, as I have mentioned, by the PhD Pavan Sinha, who is a researcher who is the professor of the vision and computational neuroscience at MIT, and he has established a foundation in India and had traveled through the rural India looking for children who are not able to get the proper help according to the different issues with sight, and who are actually not able to get help whether they are children and they fit into the critical period. So he had looked for different children, adults, adolescents, and so on, who are not seeing actually properly. What is the loss of sight? Where very often it's not the thing as we see that this is all darkness and that's all. There are different types of how much we can have our sight, let's say, downgraded. Very often it's like our eyes are not perceiving those objects and so on, because it's like it's a little closed, but it's providing some kind of light. So it can be different actually types of the intensity of light. Very often there is very easy, let's say, for nowadays it's easy, but there are ways to surgically open those eyes and to have those connections between the visual information and the brain. The question is the person able to learn how to see whether this critical period has actually ended? So PhD Pavan Sinha has decided to try and do some research on those people. In 2017, he has published the paper about his work and at his foundation, which is at his foundation, and it actually appeared that if he had taken the person who is 29 years old, he had this patient, and this patient had aphakia. It's very deeply going into the loss of the sight condition, and he opened those eyes. And afterwards, it is not really what is going on, what we see on movies. So this is not like the person is accidentally seeing and is, oh God, hello mother. No, it's completely not like this. His research is very, very interesting. 29 years old, according to the critical period, is completely like you just basically cannot even imagine thinking about gaining sight again. And this person has been able to develop certain abilities to understand the visual information. First of all, it has been only the cognitive noise. Like, this is the term we use to describe the information which is going through our senses between, like, we have different senses. So this can be cognitive noise for the eyes, for the ear, for the touch, for different type of senses. But the eyes are the fastest way to gain the information about the surrounding, about our surroundings, not ears. So this cognitive noise is very, very intense for the person who has never actually been who has never seen. Thanks to this, Dr. PhD Pavan Sinha has tried different methods to learn this patient how to develop understanding of this noise. What was very interesting, first of all, of course, it was completely it was complete mess. So the shapes were mixed, colors were mixed. It was like you turn on this TV and it's just white noise. So if we have this butterfly on the presentation, let's imagine that you perceive the butterfly's wing and the ground which is outside this butterfly as one. You don't understand the difference between those two because you don't understand the line, you don't understand this difference between the figure and the background. You actually don't understand it. The moment when you start to understand this is when this object moves, because this compound part, this group of lines, colors, blurs, textures, and so on, is moving together. And this is the moment when you start to learn how to differentiate figure from the background. So, is the perception passive or active? And should we call it the perception? In order to provide this differentiation between, in order to understand that bottle is a bottle, that butterfly is a butterfly, we have to go into our memory. If we are already adults, if you are not adults, we have to learn how to differentiate those things between themselves. There's very interesting also mechanism in ourselves, which is called emulation. Emulation is not simulation. Emulation is actually building the visual memory inside of a person and going to this memory sometimes before the language starts, the language launches in our head as the interpretation of this information, and emulator is creating the copy of everything we have connected with movement in our heads, but also if the movement is so strongly connected with the vision, we have emulation also for our visual memory. The creation is somehow the experiencing of this emulation. And here we have to ask ourselves the question, is actually creating art maybe the way to experience our visual library in ourselves? I think that if you are, well, actually, if you are an artist, you have to do several things in order to create a vision, in order to create an image. It doesn't matter if it's an image, it doesn't matter if it's an object, it's somehow the visual representation of what you are thinking about. So if we have this process of emulation, and if we connect this process to the shape and the figure and the background, we have to understand how is it built. So first we are born, we are developing the visual library in our heads, in actually the library of all things together. It's not only about, okay, this object is an object, so on. But also, like the person, what is the emotion of this person? How does it look like? What is the character of the person I'm seeing? Like, you are emulating word, then you are perceiving word, you are asking your memory and your emulator about this, and then you are performing the answer. So the artist has to go to this place, has to take this library and has to deconstruct it. This is the same process as we are doing when we are seeing, because we have to, of course, we have this process, but also we have to first decompose our scene and then compose it again. This is according to the research of Mr. Piotr Francis. I don't remember, probably a professor. He has been developing research. Wrap up? Okay. Okay, cool. So when we have, I would like to wrap up because time is passing. I have to wrap up this process on the story about the color and the color blindness. So this interesting research about the composition and decomposition, we can try on the people who are not actually having the same perception as let's say, most of us. So we have the special types of vision, which is the color blindness, which the information is not, let's say, so broad as for the neurotypical person. So I have recently had a very interesting story. So I have a friend, and this friend is actually a designer. He's a designer, and he's a designer who is well, who has the Daltonist, who is a Daltonist, and this person is able to name every color which we see. And we had been chatting, and this person has let's call him Jim. Jim has showed me throughout the conversation this image. So you have to see here the 4 types of vision according to the Daltonism. It's not only the one condition, we have different types of. And this person was able to name perfectly every color which you are seeing here, even with the tone, with the suppleness, with the brightness, with the hue, with the saturity, all of them. But when I asked about several of those images, what does he see on protanopia, he was able to call the normal vision colors from the protanopia ones. But he wasn't able to name the colors of the protanopia image. This person wasn't conscious about that he is not seeing the upper one, but he is seeing the down, like this protanopia image. It was very interesting. We have been discussing this, and after a while, let's call him Jim. After a while, Jim actually started to believe about, like, this image is the true one. So he's not seeing those upper colors, but the down ones. And then, while his mind developed the cognitive bias, there was some kind of an error. He started to look for in his memory about the names of objects, about the language. It took half an hour. He was able to reconstruct all his mind through half an hour. So this is our question: to see or to perceive, to hear or to listen. We have to decide, do we notice, spot, or just see? And the seeing is an active process of understanding word. If you see the art education, it's not only about relax, it's about actually understanding our word and naming it, and about living in the society with the deep understanding of us. Okay, thank you a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's switch to the second speaker, Mr. Mateusz Myszka, and his presentation, The Invisibility of Mortality in the Context of Poetic Discourse, the Case of Terminal Cancer.
So, hello everybody, I am grateful for being given the opportunity to present the part of my research at this event, and in my presentation I would like to focus on the poetic discourse and how it relates to the people who experience terminal cancer and how they can conceptualize their impending death. And in more general terms, this is a small case study that encapsulates the general phenomenon of how certain discourses or lack of them influences the social visibility of certain experiences. Whether we have certain language or not determines whether we can speak and make visible some aspects of our experience. And this presentation will have a tripartite structure. First, I would like to establish a theoretical framework. I intend to briefly recapitulate the notion of messianic time as described by Giorgio Agamben, with particular weight given to a brief chapter in which he describes how a poetic structure represents the messianic time in general. And later on, I will move to analyzing and juxtaposing two fictional works. One work of film, which is Wit from 2001 by Mike Nichols, adapted from a stage play by Margaret Edson, and with a collection of poems, C, by an English poet, Peter Redding. So let me start with this general observation. What is a messianic time? It is a simplified for the sake of this presentation, but basically it is this time in between that is a part of a secular time and a part of eternity at the same time, but neither of them as well. So it is this time in between, this remainder, the time that is at the end of our life on Earth, and at the same time already somewhere in this eternity that is beyond. And as a part of my larger research, I think that this interpretative tool can be transformed from this notion that refers to the fate of the entire nation to the singular experience of a person who is certain that they will soon die, because this is this certain time from the final fatal diagnosis to the actual death, that this time is somewhere in between. It is completion of what was before, and at the same time it repeats everything, it summates. It's a very very fascinating phenomena. But for the sake of this presentation, I focus on metrical schemes, because lyric poetry may be seen, especially in its more traditional forms, as something that first of all has its own time. The Agamben refers to, for example, a sonnet. It has a consistent length, and it has its own time, and it always strains towards its end. So in the poetic structure of a given form, we can see a certain eschatology that is somewhat similar to the fate of a person that would expect their death. Agamben refers to the example of Sestina. The semantic content of the poem is not important, but let us focus on the rhyme scheme, because we see that all those words that constitute the rhymes are repeated in every single stanza. So we have the soul, soul, uncle, uncle, all those words disappear, and there are 6 stanzas like that. This form is called a cruciform retrogradation. You see that when one rhyming word ends the first stanza, the second rhyming word in the following stanza is repeated. So we have this rhyme structure in a sort of anadiplosis. And after the 6 stanzas, we have the tornada, which repeats all of these crucial words in a way summates the entire poem, provides us and completes it as well, but it is not the same as the previous stanza. It is something new and something really specific. And of course, it reveals this singularity as well as this interconnectedness of these words. And what is interesting, that this form is not purely a form, but it also may be seen in the light of theology as representing the creation of the world, because those 6 first stanzas are 6 days of creation, and the last tornada is not like the previous days. It is something different. It completes them, but it is a day of the rest. It is not homologous to the first 6 stanzas. And this repetition constitutes often the ways in which we speak about dying. So and it can be seen in different types of poetry, because history and fate of rhyme coincide in poetry with the history and fate of the messianic announcement. So Agamben refers to Hölderlin, and in his poetry, when he pronounces the departure of the last God, Christ, we can see that the form of his poetry disintegrates, and we no longer has this traditional metric rhymes. And oftentimes, even in modernity, we have examples of poems which, when speaking about loss or death, utilize this very phenomenon of repetition. So we have Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night, when and Elizabeth Bishop One Art, who used the form of villanella in order to speak about loss. And another example of Les Murray, The Last Hellos, when he speaks of his dying father, and he generally, as a believer, he connects the form with with religion. So religions are like poems, poems are like religion, and in his poem, which is deprived of rhymes, he ends with this statement to his father that I wish you God, because without this form we can't speak about death as something fully complete. And then wit. The movie describes the fate of Professor Vivian Baring, a professor of English British literature, and she specializes in metaphysical poetry, and the entire film is preoccupied with language. We have this very potent image in which we have the poem screened on the wall, and she, in her dream vision, stands before this wall and distorts this poem. So this physical experience of dying distorts the poetic conceptualization of death. The organizing poem of the movie that is constantly referred is Holy Sonnet by John Donne, Death Be Not Proud, which is described the mean of conceptualizing death, but finally it appears that this statement, and death shall be no more, death thou shalt die, is not really capable of dealing with the actual excruciating pain of being in the face of death. So in the final scene, shortly before she dies, she is visited by her professor from the times she was a student at the university, who reads to her The Runaway Bunny, a children's story from 1940s, in which the little bunny threatens his mother that he will run away from her, and but finally, and he would take many different forms, but finally he returns to her. And we can see that even in this poem, the structure is somewhat similar to the traditional poetic structures, because similarly to the sestina, here we have this anadiplosis employed, because every single sentence ends and it signals the beginning of another. If you run after me, said the little bunny, I will become a fish in a trout stream and I will swim away from you. If you become a fish in a trout stream, said his mother, I will become a fisherman and I will fish for you. And finally, shucks, said the bunny, I might just as well stay where I am and be your little bunny. And this
Excuse
is
me,
very...
could you switch the slides, because we are stuck with the first one actually.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
So we can see the other slides.
So you still see the title?
Yes.
Oh, so I don't know. So there is some technical issue, I think. This is the screen from the movie I described, when she stands before this screen and this embodied experience of illness distorts the poetic discourse. And this is the scene when the professor reads to her, and this is the fragment from the children's story. And finally, when the professor departs, she says goodbye by quoting Hamlet, "Good night, sweet prince," and it all establishes different frameworks in terms of time, because this story of a little bunny, which in the movie is interpreted as a metaphor for a soul, which first comes from the heaven and is embodied and finally returns to God, presents this vision of circular time. So it is something different as well. But nonetheless, the poetry provides some form, or literature in general terms provides some forms of conceptualizing, which are distorted. We have to take into account this embodied illness, this aspect of embodiment, because we are not only speaking about death in metaphysical terms, about the soul returning to heaven, but we also have to take into account this physical pain. But still, we see some possibility, and we can see no possibility in Peter Redding's C. Peter Redding was a poet who was oftentimes described as a poet of pessimism, of nihilism, of misanthropy. And in his collection of poems, he is very interested in the poetic forms and how they relate to the experience of dying, and how they can possibly convey the experience of death. And at the very first fragment, he establishes the plan for the entire collection. Incongruously, I plan 100 100-word units. What do you expect me to do? Break into bloody haiku? Verses for healthy arty-farties? The dying and surgeons use prose. So he establishes this dynamic between verse and prose, and throughout this 100 units, he shows that, in fact, poetry may be incapable of expressing the experience of ones who are dying. So, oftentimes he uses a very shocking, very visceral, very oftentimes he breaks the decorum in order to show that dying is primarily physical. So he writes that I used to pepper my poetics with sophisticated allusions to dear opera and divine art, but suddenly these are hopelessly inadequate. Where is the European cultural significance of tubes stuck up the nose, into the veins, up the arse, and so on? And he uses different poetic forms. He, as if tests them in order to see whether one of them will finally be capable of expressing this experience. One example that I find particularly interesting is this sonnet, which is not completed. So we have only one verse of the second part. So and even in this singular verse, we have in something, 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 ashes hollow. So we have this complete disintegration of language, of poetic discourse, which is in no way capable of expressing this terminal cancer. And snot, gore, filth, separation of the Asgard, for this no metric is vindicable. And this disintegration of language goes even further when we can read such fragment. The mud trump pulls at a whiskey bottle, white horse, and gathers a perfect pentameter. Ha 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 ha. So there is, the poetry is reduced to this onomatopoeic series of sounds. So there is no possibility. Poetry cannot experience anything. And in the final single sentence, in a prosaic fragment, we can read that my wife patiently washes my fizzy besmirched pajamas for prosaic love. The poet himself underlined the word prosaic, so it seems that this experience of death can be expressed only by means of prose. And the question stands, in what ways the lack of poetic discourse may render expression of certain aspects of terminality impossible, because the prose, at least in Redding's vision, describes this outputting, disgusting aspects of physical death. And we may wonder whether there are some more higher metaphysical aspects of dying, which are in modern society rendered invisible due to the lack of traditional poetic forms who were connected with religious mindset, and how we can find new ways of expressing them in modern times. So, and that would be it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so maybe I can start with a question to the second speaker. One of the forms of literature and just a part of culture in a broader sense. Could you give us some other examples of cultural representation of terminal cancer and narratives of mortality? How mortality is narrated in various fields of culture, in different fields of culture?
Basically, this mortality can be expressed in any form of art. Prose would be the most natural in terms of expressing this actual experience of dying through memoirs, for example. So we have accounts of actual people who are describing their experience as they experience them in the real life, because those two examples that I presented are works of fiction. So they are somewhat other, and I am very conscious about the fact that I have to be really careful to draw this demarcation line between the actual experience of people dying and fictional representations of them, because to be honest, I'm more interested in how certain cultural notions relating to cancer are represented in fictional works of fiction. Sorry, it was really clumsy. But yes, and but when it comes to representing one's experience, we have I think every single form of art. I think that one of the most interesting examples from the recent years would be, for example, in music, in popular music, because I think of the last album of David Bowie, Black Star, in which he expresses these notions of terminality as well in lyrical forms, knowing that he's diagnosed with cancer. But I don't think that I could provide a detailed analysis, for example, because it would be just a name dropping of another example. So I think that every form, basically, of human expression is capable of expressing different aspects of this situation. So the poetry has this aspect of being interconnected with this most high tier of experience, let's say, I don't know, this more metaphysical aspects which may be lost in culture but might be still somewhat experienced by actual people.
Okay, thank you.
I have the question for the first presentation, because on the presentation you can show and you speak about art, and also next you speak about teaching, design teaching. Then because this profession is very young, then it's no borders, no strict borders between other arts and science. Then I'm curious how you see this. Then the borders between art and design, applied art and fine art, or maybe you see this together, because there's many points of view on this.
Okay, thank you for this question. Well, I think in my perception, the difference between fine arts and design is actually the person, is the purpose. So if we have let's say the design of fine arts, it's somehow about expressing the experience and providing some kind of emotional response, but not only. Like, I think this is the primary role of the fine arts, but it depends on the medium we are using and on the and how actually artist is planning to, because very often is a planned action, to connect with the viewer. So if we have the design part, this is, of course, this is very young branch, but also this is the creation about the connection, the person who is creating, the receiver, and an object. So for me, this is the similarity between those two. Of course, if we have design, we have first start from the receiver and then go backwards to the creator. And if we have fine arts, you can somehow reverse this action, and you can start from the creator and go straight ahead to the receiver. Both these actions has some. This is the launch, the action, and the event, and some kind of an effect. So for me, there is not very straight border, although I know like people who are doing design, not all of them perceive themselves as artists. Usually not, especially in the Western countries. It's usually viewed like if you want to be a designer, you have to, well, a little bit hide that you are an artist in your portfolio or in your curriculum vitae. But I think it's changing, because I'm seeing that design has passed the way of only trying how things work, and now this is the moment when designers are trying to find their own voice even more than they have before. So I think that this line is dissolving a bit. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
I have a question for the first speaker as well. And you mentioned that in order to have words, we have to have pictures first. Does it also apply to abstract terms like honesty, anarchy, democracy?
Somehow, yes, because we start as a blank page a little bit. We have to learn what does it mean to have democracy. We have to learn what does it mean to have an abstract point of view connected to the humanity. So, but we have to describe it in the terms of different words, of course, but those words have to come from the perceiving, like what actually is the community, what actually is the human, what the human is connected, like what is the human made of. So we are starting from the very beginning, like from the point, like with the different dimensions, and from the point we go to the line, to the plane, to the object, to the time, and so on, so on, so on. So in my perspective, this is connected as well. Like this is my perspective. And I think, well, I was trying to answer those questions because I was trying to look some let's say, how do you say the proof? I was trying to find some proofs for the importance of the site and its role in developing the personality, which is deciding how we perceive human being and democracy and our morality. And so I reached the neurotic science and neurocognitivity. And I have found also that a little bit like we perceive senses as something we are not, we can't rely on them. And it's actually based on the discourse between Plato and Aristotle, and between the relation to idea and the relation to the sense, which can dissolve our perception. But only like in the end, we have to perceive.
So maybe the last one to the second speaker. So in your presentation, you concentrated on two works, film and a poem that came from the logocentric Western cultures. So my question is, do you have any idea? Do you have any knowledge about different examples from different cultures, from non-Western cultures, examples of narratives of mortality and I don't know, representations of terminal cancer? Can you give us any examples? Can you show us the differences maybe between the cultures?
Nothing really comes to my mind at the moment. I think that one of the examples of non-Western representations of terminal cancer would be a movie Ikiru by Akira Kurosawa, which represents the story of a city clerk who experiences little stomach cancer. But Kurosawa is a really special case because he mixes this Japanese culture with this influences of canonical, unfortunately, mostly Western texts. So we have this mixture of cultures. But but there are certainly some differences which are seen, for example, in how society is ordered, because this differences between shame and guilt probably are seen, but I don't know whether those differences are very much striking, because oftentimes the experience of terminality is the experience of isolation, and it is always somewhat inscribed in a certain culture, but oftentimes it is beyond any culture. It is this very individual experience which stems from certain cultures, but may diverge in many different ways.
Thank you very much. So thank you to both of the speakers in this session for very interesting presentations. And
Questions?
let's switch to the to session number 5.